Kia ora, everyone. Welcome to our expert panel discussion. We're going to be talking about the illegal US and Israel war in Iran. We're joined by a fantastic array of guests from a range of different disciplines. I'm Kyle, your host. I am the co-founder and co-host for One of 200, uh, doing radical left media. Um, we're going to kick straight into it. Um, we have got comments turned off today. We want to uh, just have this discussion. But if you have questions coming out of this, you can always hit us up on social media, and we're happy to field questions and answer them in the kind of course of that engagement rather than during this evening. We want to try and keep this to a pretty tight hour. Um, so without further ado, I'm joined by Gabriella Brain, Nikki Haga, and Mardis Azamandi. And I'll pass it over to each of them to quickly intro themselves so that our audience has a good idea about where you come from, what your interest and area of expertise is. So Gabriella, if you want to kick us off.
Kia ora koutou. Ko Gabriella Makarita hinei tū brain a hau, he uri tēnei no Ngāti Maniapoto me Hāmoa hoki. Kia ora, my name's Gabriella. A few of you know me as Ella. I am a lawyer in terms of my day mahi. However, I'm here today as an Awa spokesperson. Awa or Anti-War Aotearoa is a newly launched kaupapa or organisation that has sparked in response to the illegal war on Iran. Awa is committed to ending New Zealand's complicity in wars of aggression. We promote respect for the United Nations Charter, a shift to a more independent foreign policy, and New Zealand's withdrawal from the AUKUS military alliance, to name a few key kaupapa. But kia ora. Thanks for having me, and it's an absolute honour to be speaking alongside Nikki and Madis, who are just incredible, amazing activists and scholars.
Kia Gabriella. Nikki, do you want to jump in next?
Kia ora tātou. Ko Nikki Haga, tōku ingoa. I'm pleased to be with you. My main engagement of issues of war is as a researcher and investigative journalist. I've spent majority of the last 20 years in the detail of wars and the detail of military forces. But that's not what I want to talk about tonight, or what we're talking about tonight. We're talking at a higher level here about foreign policy and where New Zealand should be going with its foreign policy.
Kia ora, Nikki. And Mardis.
Kia ora tātou. I'm Mardis Azarmandi. My day job would be a lecturer at the University of Canterbury, where I teach in the Faculty of Education. My background is in peace and conflict studies, where my work specifically looks at constructions of ideas of war and violence and how those are shaped by imperialism and colonialism and racism, of how we place and recognize violence in certain places and deem other places more peaceful, particularly along the lines of global north and global south. And I am also a diaspora Iranian, so I'm mainly here talking on my areas of expertise when it comes to questions of war and peace, and offering some insights from a maybe not so mainstream diasporic voice.
Kia ora, Mardis. Let's launch into the questions. Hopefully, most of the people watching tonight have been able to follow at least some of the news that's been coming out of West Asia, out of what's been happening with the illegal war on Iran. That all started with the strikes on the 28th of February. At the time, we're talking about, Nikki mentioned foreign policy. The New Zealand government just failed to condemn anything that was happening. I think everyone will have seen a couple of the clips of Prime Minister Christopher Luxon really struggling uh, to answer questions and to justify the way that he was discussing some of the atrocities that were occurring. Um, Even now, New Zealand has still failed to condemn that illegal war in any sense. However, um, they have condemned Iran's retaliatory, or you might say defensive strikes, as in a range of ways, up to and including, causing damage to the world's economy. Uh, Gabriella, what do you think we should be making of the government's response so far? And what does anti-war Aotearoa kind of see as the challenges ahead of the organization, ahead of the kaupapa, to get past some of this?
Yeah, it's disgraceful to say the least. The New Zealand government's failure to condemn this illegal war is morally reprehensible, and it's a deeply concerning continuation of this government's complicity with war crimes and human rights violations, in particular committed by the United States and Israel, that we have seen play out so explicitly over the past few years, particularly acknowledging the genocide in Gaza. And instead of condemning such an explicit act of war, criminality, and imperialist aggression, our government has instead turned the narrative, where convenient, against Iran to justify an ongoing illegal war, essentially in the name of Zionism and US fascism. And I think in particular, the government's inability to condemn the Manab school massacre, where children were murdered in a missile strike on an elementary school, exposes just the extent of the depravity of their position, and just how willfully blind this government is to the basic standards of international law. And it seems that Luxon, Winston, and Seymour are willing to throw any respect that New Zealand might have had previously for the consistent application of international law into the flames of a fascistic empire that wants to see this world burn as it loses all power and credibility on the world stage.
Kia ora. Maris, Nikki, did you either of you want to add to that?
I feel like that was a good soundbite to leave it on.
Fantastic. Nikki, as an investigative journalist, you've covered New Zealand's responses to these kind of global conflicts for decades. You mentioned that you often doing investigation about the details of some of the things that are happening here, but that also includes some of the foreign policy settings around these happenings as well. How should we try and understand the government's response to the war on Iran so far? And do you think we're really seeing a shift in how New Zealand approaches foreign policy, in particular with its the way that it relates to the US and other Western allies?
Thanks. Kia ora tātou again. I'd like to make some simple comments about this with my cold, but like some simple comments, kind of a structure for thinking about the issue for people who aren't used to foreign policy. So that's where I'm starting from. And I'll start off with, what the question was: how should we understand this government's response to the war on Iran so far? And alas, the simple answer is it's normal and predictable. It didn't come from the ministers, didn't come from public debate, came straight from the foreign affairs and defense officials who manage these things, and particularly manage these things when there's an inadequate minister who just says the words that they want to have said. And so while the world is sort of being really offended by, or shocked by the war, I have no doubt at all that there are people inside defense and inside foreign affairs who see this as an opportunity to show commitment to the US government, which is their main measure of its success. And this is a vital thing to understand. the other thing I'd like to mention, like to run through is alliances. We think of alliances being about weapons and military exercises. But one of the worst things about an alliance is it requires a country to practice selective morality, portraying its own values and beliefs. The allies are expected, allies like New Zealand are expected, at least most of the time, not to criticize the actions of their alliance partners or their alliance partners. And so you can have human rights abuses, you can have invasions, you can have breaches of international law, and meddling in other people's countries, while loudly denouncing precisely the same behavior with the alliance partners' enemies. If you understand what I mean. Countries are expected to, for instance, criticize deeply another country having nuclear weapons. But then when it comes to the nuclear weapons of their friends and their allies, there's a deathly silence. And this makes hypocrites of us all.
Yeah, just on that note, around nuclear weapons, this has been one of the justifications, right? That's being used by the US in particular, and being amplified across Western media. I think it's even been mentioned by some of our own government ministers as well, that they want to stop or slow down Iran's nuclear enrichment, or once again, they're close to having a nuclear weapon, which has been the case for 40 odd years, apparently. But the US has been offering these justifications. They've been coming up with reason after reason why this war has to happen. The most ludicrous at this point is that now they must be waging war to open the strait that they've closed. How do we unpack that? And how should we try and get past that to understand this particular conflict? And what do you think is motivating the US and Israel in this case, rather than the justifications that we are told are the reasons for this illegal war?
Who are you talking to?
I think it
Ah,
speaks to something that Nikki was saying. Or was that question for me? Or was it for
Yeah.
Nikki? Okay.
okay.
Everyone weigh in as needed.
And it is that everything that we see is not exceptional to a particular kind of Trump government, right? So I think the first thing I would like to say that while there are particularities to Netanyahu and Trump as politicians and some of the things that they do and say, I don't think that they are exceptional in the way that Israeli politics has conducted itself or US politics has conducted itself on Iran in the last 40 something years. So I think that needs to be established first. And it's very much in line with how the West has been looking at places in West Asia for the longest time. I would say in the case of the United States, probably since the late 1960s, when the US emerges as the global hegemon and kind of consolidates its power and takes on a particular kind of interest in the countries in, quote unquote, the Middle East or West Asia. And if we look at the justifications, the named justifications or the kind of unnamed justifications for the war, there's also nothing new about that. If people are watching, and in this conversation, some of us were, a bit older, would remember the US invasion of Iraq and the justifications used for that. So I think this lines up with a particular kind of US imperial political orientation towards West Asia. And what we see is a culmination of all of those practices. So what Nikki is saying, that this is not unusual, this is a normal response to our foreign policy, that we condone certain countries for having nuclear weapons and others we don't, is that the question of sovereignty is one that is really central in the current global order. And for the United States in particular, and I would say the US imperial and Europe imperial power, so I wouldn't kind of let Europe off the hook, has been to destabilize the West Asia as a region and make sure that there are no sovereign nations left. And Iran is obviously an obstacle to that, because in the last 46 years, it has consolidated its sovereignty, the sovereignty that it gained through a popular revolution in 1979. And the way that is being talked about is to constantly question that sovereignty. And we see this questioning of sovereignty actually across different political spectrums as well. So I would say even within the so-called progressive left, people give Iran only conditional sovereignty. So I think first and foremost, I would say reasons for the US war on Iran is Iran's sovereignty and undermining Iran's sovereignty through de-development. So very strategically attacking Iran in its infrastructure, in its civilian infrastructure, in its capacity to develop itself. That includes obviously the ability to defend itself militarily, but also to develop the capacity to reproduce. So develop internally, have a healthcare system, have an educational system, and so forth. So I think that's really, really fundamental. So I think when people constantly point out that there are civilian sites being bombed, and trying to present that as somehow an outrage, a violation of the international legal system, we already know that the international legal system is really selective, that the laws of the liberal West have been suspended for 2.5 years with the genocide in Gaza, but we've seen that also before and we'll see it again. So I think we're constantly seeing the system being exposed at this moment in time. So for me, the war on Iran is the war on its sovereignty, because Iran has not been folded into the US imperial order yet. So it's been a defiant state, whatever people might think of that state. It is one that retains full sovereignty over its territory and over its relationships with other countries. The other one is Iran's position on Palestine, which again, on the right and on the left, people like to question. But one of the reasons why Israel in particular has the antagonistic relationship it has with Iran is Iran's position on Palestine, and Iran's relationship with other countries in the region or other groups in the region, all of which are groups that are contesting and trying to be sovereign, or at least defend themselves against Israeli aggression, with Hezbollah being one in Lebanon, right? And to me, that all comes back to the question that Nikki points out when it comes to foreign policy, is that what we see in the West now is that actually Western countries are not quite as sovereign to decide how they relate and how they respond to clearly illegal wars that are deemed illegal within the international system that these systems have agreed to abide by. So these are not systems developed by countries in the global South. These are the rules of the West. These are the rules of the liberal order. And when it now comes to condemning US-Israeli aggression or acknowledging US-Israeli war crimes, we find countries tiptoe around having an explicit stance. And they tiptoe around that by trying to paint the other country, so the country that is currently being attacked, as somehow also problematic. And because it is problematic, we can therefore not unilaterally condone clearly legally identifiable crimes on the sides of the Israelis and the Americans. To start, that this is a completely illegal war. There's no way we can legally justify the bombing of Iran to start with. We can clearly see that the bombing of the Manab school, which is very much on brand for Israeli bombings, and I think was meant to shock the Iranian population into revolting. So I think it was deliberately targeting a school just to make sure that it caused so much horror and shock that people would kind of rebel and want everything to be over really quickly. But that's just my personal opinion here. But we know that has been now acknowledged to have been a strike carried out by these groups. And it's very hard still for people to come out and say that's clearly a war crime, but we focus on Iranians' defense and targeting of US military assets in the region. So the framing in the media has been Iran is attacking these other countries in the Gulf, but it's never framed that Iran is responding to military sites that are placed in those areas. So I think the deliberate framing is very much, again, on brand for how imperialism has talked about places outside of who are its allies, right? And that plays a big role and has shaped fundamentally the capacity of people in the West to come out and speak against a war on Iran because of 40 years of how these places have been framed. On the right and on the left, I would say. And they are trying to keep this aggression as somehow being about nuclear enrichment or being about Iran's domestic missile system or about Iran being supposedly the biggest threat to world peace. Right? So I think those are the distractions, but fundamentally, what they're trying to do is to make sure that Iran will never be sovereign again, that it will never have the capacity to be an independent state. And in some ways, I would say this war in Iran is a war on its 1979 revolution. It's making Iran pay for becoming sovereign in 1979. Again, you don't have to like Iran to acknowledge that prior to 1979, it was not fully sovereign. It was not an independent state. It had not full access over its resources and its relationships. In fact, it was, very much like other countries in the region. And since 1979, it has managed under some of the most severe sanction regimes imposed on other countries to develop. And to provide for its people. And the attacks on its civilian infrastructure shows that it's an attack on that development and trying to de-develop Iran. So I just want to give some examples of that. Steel factories have been impacted. The Pasteur Institute that develops vaccines, which was developed in the early 20th century, so I think 1918, that produces all the vaccines in Iran, right? So targeting sites like that, which have nothing to do with the Islamic Republic per se, because they existed way before, not that that matters, to be honest, are making sure that the civilian development and the civilian well-being of that country is so diminished that it cannot recover. And until now, like Iran has been able to withstand and respond to these attacks, but the focus on these sites of destruction has been largely absent, I would say, in how we've talked and responded to this war.
Yeah, and it's something that we've seen, as you mentioned, in Palestine, in Gaza first of all, and then increasingly in the West Bank, in Lebanon, in Syria as well. I think this targeting of infrastructure of sovereignty as the spreading of the kind of imperialist project. Lebanon now in particular has been targeted in this way more and more frequently. And even while the war in Iran goes on, and we don't see much reporting about that, we see even less about Lebanon. Gabriella, with the ways in which we understand this, the ways that we can kind of track this back to 1979, the way that Marius described the use of international law. We've seen this unprecedented erosion of international law, at least as far as the theater of kayfabe of it goes, even as a way to legitimize Western imperial power. Is there even any point to be talking about international law at this point, rather than trying to shift towards a kind of moral outcome or something similar?
Yeah, just kia ora to Madis. I thought that was just the most precise mapping of the geopolitical situation and history that we're dealing with here. So thank you for setting that out so clearly for our audience tonight. And I completely tautoko everything that you said in relation to the international legal system, the ways in which it's been set up to protect certain Western powers, the fact that it's effectively collapsed over the past few years of genocide in Gaza that it has effectively enabled with impunity, and the horrific precedent that the genocide has created for the machinery of 21st century war crimes. Also acknowledging that none of this is exceptional. Furthermore, to the 21st century, we know that the United States has committed such horrific acts of genocidal war against, against sovereign states that it deems to be threats to the maintenance of empire and exploitation through, the economy that it's tried to impose on the entirety of the world to effect. I think in terms of the place of international law within this climate, and more in particular, the ways in which we can strategize around it, it is also true that the New Zealand government still has this enduring obligation to uphold international law, and in particular, the United Nations Charter, which is the foundational document of the United Nations, to respect the equal sovereignty of states, which we need to strategically remind this government of its hypocrisy against these legal standards and rules, to effect change against their ongoing complicity. Particularly going into an election year where with this government in particular, we know that they'll be repeating their ridiculous tough on crime messaging to beat down on, marginalised communities within Aotearoa. However, I've never seen a government so weak on war crimes. So how can you talk about tough on war when the precedent that you've set for yourself over, the entirety of your election term has just been so ridiculously weak on war crimes, on crimes of genocide, crimes against humanity. And, these are the real crimes that threaten democracy, peace, and justice for Aotearoa and, the wider Ao. It's not ram raids, it's not gang patches, it's the depravity of genocide and illegal wars of aggression that this government has been complicit in. And so, in terms of, again, just thinking through strategizing around international law, I did want to acknowledge today the incredible win of PSNA for judicial review against the super fund, where PSNA and their lawyers, successfully showed that the super fund's removal of the United Nations Global Compact and other, human rights instruments and standards from its policies around investing in different companies, and in particular for PSNA's cases, companies involved in Israeli illegal settlements, they found that to be unlawful because of the case that they brought. And I think that was, a particularly strategic and tactical example of how international law and even our own, domestic legal tools can be used in times like these to hold systems to account and to demonstrate complicity according to their own language that they, supposedly love to uphold and maintain. And, as Medusa's already set out for us, this war is so clearly an illegal war. It began with the most hideous war crime on an elementary school and was a hideous violation of the United Nations Charter and Iranian state sovereignty, to unsuccessfully enact a change of government and to punish Iran for its, its history of resistance against US empire. And our government has failed to condemn this violation of international law and therefore has failed to uphold its responsibility to international law. And I think that is something that we do need to strategically use in our public messaging, around getting as many people on board, responding to this illegal act of war, and also to prevent the New Zealand government from further complicity.
Kia ora, Gabriella. Nikki, you were talking about the way that some of these ministries work with regards to the foreign policy settings. How do you think that operates when it comes to questions like this of international law and New Zealand government and by extension the New Zealand public's complicity in war crimes and kind of crimes against humanity?
I'll start by saying it's refreshing to hear the previous speakers talking about the real issues, but the way that issues get managed when you don't want to take notice of them is not by addressing the issues, it's by a series of things which I'd like to point out, like, for example, just never addressing the issue, by keeping issues secret, and generally by hoping that there will be an absence of public debate. And if you succeed in the absence of public debate and the absence of public engagement, well, then you've basically won. And I want to give an example of the kind of, so it's useful to be able to recognize the diversions when you see them. And the classic diversion from which you will get from the standard lines written into the standard briefings for the minister who doesn't really know their issue very well. The kind of thing that will be written into it is, I'm having a meeting today with my colleagues from the United States or Australia, and then they start using these cliches. And I just like to run through some of them because they are so pitiful. They don't seem like they should have the power, but they do. They fill up the time and they block real debate. So, for example, the first thing they say is, we're traditional partners. We're New Zealand and my special guest here are special partners out of our traditional allies or traditional partners, which is like Canada and Australia and the United States and Britain. And then they say, and why does this matter? Because we've got shared values. Now, this is really important. It might sound sort of trite and ludicrous, but actually you have to name the things that they're saying and debunk them. So does New Zealand and the US and Australia have shared values? Do we have the same values as a country, as an aggressive nuclear power that starts and supports more wars than any other country on earth? We should ask that. We should ask that every time this kind of line comes up. And do we have shared interests? Has a small South Pacific country really got such shared interests with countries which are invading other ones and planning war for our largest trading partner, and getting together with a country which is like a role model of a dangerous decline as an undemocratic government? And so if you just, in the most superficial ways, look at the basis of this justification we have, traditional partners, shared interests, shared friendships, and actually bother to pick it apart, is utterly ludicrous. And yet, I read these things, I watch these things, the same words and the same cliches come up in briefing after briefing after interview as the years roll on. And they fill the space, and unless there's something acute, like the war going on with people bothering to discuss it, that pep, that nonsense fills up the space, and that's the entire debate we have. And that's what the thing I said, the perfect situation for people who are doing something which they know that their own citizens won't support is simply to have silence, to have no discussion going on.
Do you think that, in that sense, that New Zealand really even has a foreign policy at this stage? Or are the kind of the claims that we are just fully outsourcing our foreign policy to the US or Five Eyes partners, etc., really do ring true?
No, I don't want to be negative because I think they'd be happy for me to say that. What we've got in New Zealand, Aotearoa, is we've got two foreign policies. And it's, again, this is one of those things which doesn't get said, but I think it's really important to be specific about what's going on. We've got one foreign policy, which is the one we've been alluding to, and various of us have talked about, which is the automatic assumption that white Anglo-Saxon, Anglo-American military powers are us. That's where our future is. They're our natural partners and and we care so much about our relationship with them that of course we're going to go to war sometimes and buy more arms and things because we gain so much from this precious relationship with our nearest and dearest. Okay, so that's foreign policy number one. As I was saying, dressed up in nonsense talk, or even preferably no talk at all. So foreign policy just never makes the news. But then we've got foreign policy number two, which is the one which gives me great hope for our country, which is that for the last 100 years, pretty much, maybe since the time of the First World War, and the soldiers coming home thinking, what the hell were we doing in Gallipoli? What were we dying for? And so on through many wars and many situations since. We've had a country which is gradually becoming less militaristic, considerably, becoming more Polynesian, becoming the average setting of most New Zealanders is peaceful and believing in a country which helps to resolve conflicts rather than to create them. And that's just as real, in fact, more real than the one which is perpetuated by the foreign affairs people and the right-wing politicians. And if you look at the numbers on this, there are many. The surveys show that if you ask people, I've got one in front of me here, the Pew Research Centre, their most recent survey was 5 years ago. They said, is the US a good model of democracy for other countries to follow? New Zealand, when that question was asked, had the lowest rating in the world. That was our, wonderful that we can see this. This was our fellow citizens were thinking, no, we hate that. We might watch US politics like a soap opera, but it's not us. It's not the future we want. We know who we are. And even when we go to wars, and even when they buy more military equipment, the great river of the country that's flowing along with all those people in it who aren't being asked their opinions, but they've got opinions, and no one's necessarily listening to their values, but their values are strong, or their values are latent, and all mostly pointing one way. That great river is flowing on, and that's stronger than a few smarty pants diplomats in Wellington being pleasing partners for their Anglo-Saxon friends.
Okay. I guess kind of following on from that, just to whoever wants to answer it, because it's one of those big questions, right? We've got this disjunction between the public opinion around this stuff that's shifting more and more rapidly, and this is happening across the West, particularly looking to Gaza and now Iran. Between that public opinion and the political decision making. So where do we find the space to unpack that, to talk about it in the way that Nikki has described, or actually naming it, and get past some of that pap, some of those trite terms, some of that silence, to enforce the popular will on our national politics?
Shall I start? And I hope the others will talk too. I think the main thing is making space for it, and the government's not going to make space for it, not the current government, but making space for it. That means people who care about this, creating opportunities, writing, talking, building coalitions of people. It's actually, I believe that the basic values, I've already said this, but the basic values of most New Zealanders are pretty solid in what we would like them to be about war and peace. And then it's the job of the people who are organized and motivated about it to give that a voice. give those feelings a voice for people, and to speak for them, help to speak their beliefs as well into something which is not just in their own head. And we can do that. That's not something which can be restricted by the military or something, or by another country. That is in the power of the people of this country to do that. And the fact that we've been kind of maybe a bit lulled into inactivity by the way that the diplomats and people talk about it, which is go to sleep territory. But leaving that aside, luckily, we're a country where if people get organized, they can get results on something like this, and they will.
I'm usually not. If people know me, they will laugh now, probably watching. I wouldn't describe myself as a very optimistic person, but I do really appreciate what Nikki is saying here, and I do to some extent agree with it. I do agree that most people, if asked if they want war, if they want peace, they would choose peace, particularly in this country. However, that space to make that decision and come forward and embrace a non-militaristic outlook, choose to focus on policies that make the world a more livable place for people locally and hopefully also for people globally, requires us to look at things differently than we currently are. So I think there has been, when it comes to particularly this particular moment with Iran, something that's different from previous moments. So when we saw the war in Iraq in 2003 and the lead up to the war in Iraq, which was obviously already after the war in Afghanistan, so the public had already been shaken up and there was circulation of media of the impact of that and the immense loss of human life. There was mobilizations across Western cities in the millions, I remember Germany had millions of people out in the street. It became an election defining issue. Not that I think the political parties were necessarily invested in the lives of Iraqis, but they realized that the public is out in the street and does not want to go to war, and they took advantage of that. And the party that's clearly stood against going to war won the elections that year. We had millions of people in Spain. Spain initially had a conservative government that went to war, and then change of government, they withdrew their troops. So in Europe, which is where I was placed in 2003, we saw mass mobilizations. We have also now seen that the question of Palestine has shifted globally in the last 2.5 years. So what used to be, I think, a very clear issue for many people on the left, especially for people who are anti-imperialist or anti-colonialist, has become an issue that I would say in my surrounding, most people I know, independently of their political views, or if they are people who would describe themselves as political, very much support an end of the occupation and a free Palestine. Now, you would have expected that with that mobilization and the conscientization that took place large scale across the world when it comes to Gaza, partially because the genocide was live streamed, but also because of the work that groups that have been doing Palestine solidarity have been putting into political education and consciousness raising, that would translate to this moment and this attack on Iran. And it hasn't. And I ask myself, why hasn't it? And I think that's the other point that Nikki made. Nikki is really laying the cards out for me to respond. And that's the stories we tell and what we don't say. This idea of tapping into our connection of values, these people are like us, and these people are not like us, has happened for 40-something years with Iran. And it's very hard to people to see Iran as anything else but how it has been created in the imagination of Western media in particular. And I would say also within activist circles. So now the conversation that I think is important, Nikki is right, we need need to broaden the conversation that we're having. The conversation we're having is not how do we mobilize more people to stop the war on Iran, because we've already, annihilated a population over in Gaza. We shouldn't be annihilating more people in Lebanon and more people in Iran. The conversation in the public realm, at least among progressives that we're having, is about nuance. It's not about how do we get more people in the street to hold our governments accountable, or to at least say they don't want a part in it, like it is happening, for example, in Italy, a very conservative country, I would say. And the fact that Meloni is now having a turn when it comes to Italian politics on Israel is not suddenly because she's having a moral or ethical awakening. It's because she's responding to the demands of the people inside Italy, right? We haven't seen that yet. What we need to have is we need to not shy away from views that are different. And I think when it comes to Iran, we need to not shy away from hearing things on Iran that really make us feel bad in our political views. I think there's a lot of censoring happening in the name of nuance, in the name of criticality, in the name of progressiveness. Instead of creating more democracy, we have to have a consensus on issues, and we have to see eye to eye. And I think that is detrimental to change making. We need to use all the tools we have, including international law, including coalition building, including working with people we don't like, including standing up for countries we might not like. So I do agree with Nikki. I think in general, the public is there. In general, we need more broadening the conversation and making something that the public can respond to. But we haven't done that. And I think we're failing. We're failing in ways that I didn't see us fail in 2003. Like, I would have expected the same mobilizations that I saw for the war in Iraq, because it's very similar, the issues that are being put up, the lying, the manipulation, the manufacturing of consent followed very much the same playbook. It's just that Iran responded in a very different way, obviously. So for me, I think I'm kind of like hung up here. And I think the way the imagination works around these shared values is core. These shared values of people who are the same and people who are not the same, or people who might not even be considered people, is something that we, if we live in the West, have to really work against, and call ourselves on it as well. And I don't know if you have a question about the kind of like conflicting views on Iran and the diaspora, because I do have a kind of anecdote that speaks to the mobilization of values as well.
I think just roll straight into that.
Okay, so here's a fun anecdote. I saw somebody who I am related to go to a protest well, mind you, I'm just going to say it, in Canada. It's not like people can find out who it was. To a pro-monarchist demonstration before the war started, calling for regime change, calling for Reza Pahlavi to be the new, I'm not sure if they're advocating for him to be king, but he's the son of the former Shah. I don't know what his other credentials are apart from being the son of the former Shah. And at that protest, people were handing out these little bits of paper that looked like they were the inside of a fortune cookie. So kind of like that same shape. So somebody took a picture at that protest holding said little fortune cookie piece of paper up, and it says, I am here because I stand with Western values. I obviously took a screenshot of it, and I thought it was it was interesting to me, because as a person who grew up in the West, whose work is particularly invested in how what is considered to be the West has become to be so powerful, which is through dispossession, theft, colonization, and imperialism, and again, practices of genocide, I had to chuckle and say, what are these Western values that you're standing there for? Yes, maybe they are dispossession, theft, capitalism, imperialism, and genocide. But that's not really very mature of me. But this is how one particular branch of the diaspora positioned itself against the Islamic Republic, right? So this is the framing that we have done constantly, is to say we are good, we are good, we are peaceful, we are democratic. Now, the facts tell a different story, right? So while we may be or may not be various degrees of democratic, and I think we can say that there are various degrees of democracy, which clearly the New Zealand public knew in the Pew uh, survey that they took, that US democracy is not something that they would want. We also see that our democracies are becoming increasingly more authoritarian, right? So when it comes to Palestine activism, environmental activism, but also political dissent, right? So we're constantly seeing civil rights being suspended in places that we consider to be, like beacons of democracy, places like Germany. But I would also say places like Australia and New Zealand, Queensland, making it criminalizing the slogan from the river to the sea. We see this authoritarianism within our own nations. We say we're peaceful if we look at the track record of places like the United States when it comes to waging war, the places like Europe and waging and being involved in war. The facts tell a different story, right? But we have attached democracy, freedom, values to one particular part of the globe, a geographic and imaginary part of the globe. And then everybody else has to be not that, right? And the fact that peace has become so attached to democracy is very hard for the people to mobilize for peace for countries that are quote unquote not democratic, right? Because somehow they're not as deserving of peace. And a good example of how peace is mobilized to justify war on other people is Israel's repeated slogan, "We are the only democracy in the Middle East," as if somehow being the only democracy in the Middle East allows you to wage war and everybody just gets bombed into oblivion, right? So I think this is one of those other ways I think we can add to the list, the amazing list that Nikki just laid out of these tropes that work to distract us. I kind of lost my train of thought, but I think I leave it here and then you can ask another question and I can collect myself.
Gabrielle, do you want to just jump in on that broader question, just as we...
I don't think I really have anything to add other than the just incredible articulation of the issues and dynamics at play here. I think, yeah, both is definitely true in the sense that, the New Zealand public, I mean, most people you talk to believe in peace, they believe in justice, they believe in democracy. They're horrified when they hear of these horrific war crimes and these massacres that are taking place, upon the complicity of our own government. I also think there's an enormous amount of work that needs to be done to actually clarify the geopolitical history and dynamics that are actually at play here. And I hope that this conversation, has highlighted or illuminated those dynamics. And it obviously needs to be an ongoing conversation. But in terms of, mobilizing the public, there's an enormous space of potential that's being activated here. And I think, riding off of, well, not riding off of, but with the, mobilizations that have been happening in solidarity with Palestine, the March for Humanity last year, and the swell of protests that we saw on Tāmaki streets, I think more and more people are waking up to the geopolitical realities that are at play here. And I won't give any specific details, but Awa as a kaupapa, and maybe, you, Kyle, can further speak to this, since you are also a spokesperson for the kaupapa. I know you've got your 1 of 200 hat on, but, you're part of the crew. There will be a call to action in the next few weeks to hopefully get this momentum rolling to display, the anger of the New Zealand public in response to our government's failure to uphold international law, to condemn horrific war crimes, and this illegal war on Iran, as well as the wider region and the role that it has played in the resistance against US imperialism and Zionism.
Kia ora, Gabriella. Nikki, did you have? I'm just also aware we're coming up to time, so we'll do a last round of final thoughts. And any other calls to action? Nikki, did you have anything else that you wanted to add?
No, I've been watching the time like the rest of you, and we're coming up to the end. So thank you for having me. I think we've been doing exactly what people should be doing. So I think that's a good note to finish on.
And Maris.
Maybe I have a note as somebody who's research life, but I think also that kind of like a kaupapa that drives me. That is the question of peace, which I think imperialism is the biggest threat to peace on a global level. And if we're serious about imagining a war in which war becomes obsolete, in which countries do not have to arm themselves in self-defense, in which we can say that you don't have to engage in deterrence politics, because we can also now see that we said for many years deterrence politics is over. That was part of the Cold War era. You don't need to have nuclear weapons for countries not to attack you. In some ways, this war in Iran has also shown, I guess, no, countries have to be armed to their teeth to be able to not be bombed into oblivion. So if we do not want a world like that, then we need to take imperialism seriously as the primary contradiction. But if we don't want to take imperialism seriously and we just want to live in a world where we don't see people die and we want to be kind to our neighbor and we don't necessarily want to think of all the macro levels, that's great too. Then let's not find reasons to stop people from coming out. I think at this moment in time, my goal is I don't care what motivates somebody to come out into the street and stand for justice, whether that is against this government's blatant attack on Maori rights, this government's inability to stop or say anything against the genocide in Gaza, or make a meaningful comment about this illegal war in Iran. So we should come out into the streets with whatever differences we have, united in the conviction that at least war is bad. And then we can figure out all of these ways in which we disagree, in which we imagine the steps to go 5 steps further or not. But I think what I am seeing at the moment is that we get caught up in these politics of purity at a time of annihilation. Like I just really want to say there are people who are, celebrating the forms in which the Iranian people are resilient and steadfast and are resisting. And I understand that from an anti-imperialist point of view, that can be powerful to watch a country in isolation and starved by sanctions, crippled by sanctions, being steadfast. But it's a population at war. It's a population that is being killed. It's a population whose infrastructure has been destroyed. And that's horrible. Its neighbors in Lebanon are not even in the news. We have seen Israel drop 100 bombs in 10 minutes on Lebanon. This is not about some theoretical abstractions about where we stand in our politics of resistance. Like, we need to do something and we need to pay some kind of price. And I'm not talking about the gas prices here. So if we're really committed that we don't want, at bare minimum, other innocent people to die, we need to figure out how we can get more people to talk about it and more people to come out into the street. Right? So nobody's asking us to give lives and nobody's asking us to give a building. But I think to get caught up in conversations about purity and who deserves and who doesn't deserve to have sovereignty plays into the hands of the people who are trying to annihilate. Okay? And this is not trying to create some kind of false binary. In very material terms, you do something to stop the annihilation of people, or you don't. right? And there's no miraculous third way somewhere that you can engage in. So I think that's kind of what I want to say to people. You don't care about the broader political pictures, all good. Just come out and say, no more war. I've got a toddler that's not even 2. She went to a protest in Christchurch. She came home and she said, no war. So I feel like if she, as a baby, is 9 months, 1 year, 9 months old, can walk away and realize that that's an important thing to repeat, this should be something that the broader, I would say, peace-loving New Zealand public should be able to embrace.
Tataka. Yeah, it's about solidarity with the people being murdered, in their thousands at the moment. And as you say, once the annihilation has been halted, maybe then we can have those conversations. But there's a material reality that's taking place right now. You either stand against that or you don't. And that can be really confronting for some people to hear. But I do challenge everyone and like plead with everyone to think about that and to connect with different groups and to have these discussions and get out on the streets when the opportunity presents itself. I just want to say thank you so much to everyone who's joined us on the panel this evening. Thank you so much to our audience for listening in. Um, as Gabriella said, we hope to have some more news, some potential for action in the near future. So keep an eye on Anti-War Aotearoa as well. Thank you, Gabriella, for joining us from Anti-War Aotearoa. Thank you, Nikki. Thank you, Madis. I've really appreciated hearing your voices, and I'm sure that our audience has as well, to hear a good, clean hour of articulation of what's happening, and just referring back to what Nikki was saying, where we're naming some of the things that are happening here, rather than letting that be pushed into the background or not spoken about at all. Even the act of naming those things can be really powerful, and I think this has been really useful for that. So thank you again. That's been the expert panel. This will go up, this will stay on the YouTube. So if you have got something out of this, if you feel like this helped clarify things for you, or you feel like it could help clarify things for someone else, please share the link. That'll be put up onto our social media as well. So you can check that out through one of 200. We'll look into putting it up as a podcast episode in an audio format, if that suits you better, or if it suits your friends and family better. And hopefully you'll see a few clips come out of this as well, with some of those points being made throughout the evening. That's been an expert panel with one of 200. We'll catch you next time. Kia ora.
Soda.